The hammer fell, the sound cracking through the dust-choked air of Fort Redemption, like a dead branch snapping. On the crude auction block, Alara stood, her son clutched to her chest, a shield of innocence against the leering eyes of the crowd. They saw a broken woman, number 7 chalked on her skirt, a piece of used-up property. But from the shadows of the far wall, a man saw something else. He saw a wildfire banked to embers, a spirit that refused to kneel. His name was Kale, a name whispered like the wind across the plains, and in his eyes, the reflection of her defiance burned as bright as his own. He had come for supplies, not for a soul. But the moment his gaze met hers, a cord of fate, ancient and unbreakable, pulled taut between them. He watched the auctioneer sneer, heard the degrading bids, and a cold, possessive fury rose in him. He would not let this world break her. He would not let them have her. He stepped forward, the crowd parting before him like wheat before a storm. 20 gold pieces. His voice cut through the murmurs, deep and final. For the woman and the child, now. Part 1. The Claim in the Chaos. The air in Fort Redemption was a thick cocktail of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey. For Alara, it was the smell of the end of the world. Each slam of the auctioneer's gavel was a hammer blow against her soul. The baby in her arms, Leo, whimpered, his tiny fists twisting the worn fabric of her dress. He was a part of her. The only pure thing left in a life that had been systematically stripped bare. A week ago, she was part of a wagon train, a widow with a future hazy but present. Now, cast out and labeled a burden, she was chattel. The man with the gavel, a greasy specimen named Silas, barked prices like he was selling cattle. She can cook, $20. A woman was dragged away. Strong arms on this one, 15. Another life sold. Then, his eyes landed on Alara. Fresh arrival, got a babe, but good hips. Fine breeding stock, will start at 10. A snort from the crowd. 10's too high for a weeper. I'll give 5 if she drops the kid. The laughter that followed was a physical blow, buckling her knees. Rough hands shoved her forward. Show your face, girl. Silas snapped. She turned, her chin lifted in a final fragile act of defiance. She held Leo like a monarch holding a scepter, her gaze sweeping over the jeering faces, wide, flushed, and utterly devoid of surrender. And that is when she saw him. He was not like the others. Where they were a chaotic mass of greed and grime, he was a pillar of stillness. He stepped from the shadows of the trading post's far wall, a man carved from the very rock and wind of the frontier. He was tall, dressed in supple buckskin that fit him like a second skin, adorned with intricate beadwork that spoke of a different world. His long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and his eyes, they were the color of a stormy sky, unreadable and intense. They weren't looking at her body, her good hips. They were looking into her soul, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt seen, not appraised. A deep, firm voice sliced through the noise. 15. Every head turned. Silas squinted. That you, Kale? Didn't figure you for this kind of market. The man, Kale, ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Alara, a silent promise passing between them. The connection was instantaneous, a spark of recognition in the desolate wasteland of her despair. It felt like a memory of a love she'd never known. Silas scoffed. You ain't got coin like that, wanderer. Kale didn't flinch. He reached into a pouch at his belt and tossed a heavy silver pendant onto the stage. It was carved with the symbol of a hawk in flight. That's more than your price, he said, his voice low and laced with a dangerous calm. And she is not property. She walks with me because I have said so. The air crackled with tension. Silas stared at the pendant, then at the unyielding man before him. There was a power emanating from Kale that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with an ancient, untamable authority. He was a force of nature, and Silas, for all his bluster, was just a man. He grumbled, but nodded, snatching the pendant. The deal was done. Kale didn't wait for a dismissal. He strode toward the stage, his presence parting the crowd. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he simply stood before her, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at the sleeping baby in her arms. "Come," was all he said. The word was not a command, but an invitation into a new reality. Alara didn't know his name, didn't know his tribe or his intentions, but in that moment, she knew him. She knew the certainty in his eyes, the protective wall of his presence. She clung to his word like a prayer, stepping off the stage and into the space he had carved out for her in the world. As she walked behind him away from the stench of Fort Redemption, a wild, irrational heat bloomed in her chest. It was not just gratitude. It was a fierce, possessive, and utterly insane surge of love for the stranger who had claimed her not as property, but as his own. They walked until the fort was a smudge on the horizon, the sounds of its cruelty fading into the whisper of the wind, and for the first time, Alara felt the earth solid beneath her feet. Part 2. The language of a wild heart. The silence that stretched between them was not empty. It was a living thing, filled with the unspoken questions and the deafening roar of their meeting. Kale walked with a deliberate, grounded pace, a rhythm that seemed to soothe the frantic beat of Alara's heart. Her arms ached from clutching Leo, but she couldn't, loosen her grip. The boy was her anchor, and this man was her tide, pulling her toward an unknown shore. He finally paused at a bend in the trail, where a narrow creek whispered between two towering birch trees. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, casting long shadows that danced like spirits. He had not spoken a single word since claiming her, and a part of her, the part that had been trained to be small and silent, was terrified. But another, wilder part, a part she was just beginning to recognize, drank in his silence. It was a language more profound than words. As they stopped, she studied him. His face was sun-worn, etched with lines of experience that made him impossible to age. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They didn't dart, they observed, taking in the world with a calm intensity that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He turned to her, and the full force of his gaze felt like a physical touch. He gestured to the stream, his movements economical and precise. "You and the child," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "Drink. Rest." She hesitated, the question tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. "Why? Why did you help me?" He held her gaze, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "Because you looked at them as a human being, not an animal to be sold. And because the child in your arms," he glanced at Leo, who had indeed gone quiet, lulled by the rhythm of their walk, "did not cry when I spoke." He paused, and a flicker of something raw and vulnerable crossed his features. "And because when I saw you, my soul recognized its missing half." The confession hung in the air, audacious and utterly sincere. Alara's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her with such devastating honesty. She knelt by the water, the cold shock a welcome distraction from the inferno he had ignited within her. She splashed her face, letting the cool water soothe her cracked lips and wash away the grime of the fort. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He crouched beside her, their reflections shimmering together on the water's surface. He scooped water in his palm, the gesture impossibly gentle. "Kale," he said. "It means the storm that protects." "I am Alara," she replied, "and this is Leo." Kale nodded once, his eyes tracing the curve of her cheek. He pulled dried meat and flatbread from his pouch, breaking it and handing half to her. The simple act of sharing food felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. He didn't press for her story, didn't ask about the husband who had left her a widow or the wagon train that had abandoned her. He simply accepted her presence, her past a shadow he was not afraid of. As they ate, a profound intimacy grew in the quiet space. Every shared glance, every accidental brush of their hands as she reached for the waterskin, was charged with an electric current. This was not the timid courtship of the world she had left behind. This was something elemental, a magnetic pull between two people who understood the language of survival and solitude. When they finished, he led her further off the trail, into a thicket where the trees grew dense and wild. Hidden behind a moss-covered ridge stood a shelter made of wood and earth. It was carefully built, temporary, yet strong. A place that existed because someone had once needed to disappear. A place of safety. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his voice soft. "It is not much, but no one will follow you here." She turned to him, the moonlight catching the silver tears in her eyes. "Why me, Kale?" "The truth." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he was a looming shadow of warmth and strength. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was fire. "'Cause I looked at you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "And I saw the rest of my life. I saw you shaking, but you did not kneel. And I knew I would spend all my days making sure you never had to again." For Alara, those words were not kindness. They were a vow. They were the beginning of a love story written not in ink, but in dust, fire, and the wild beating pulse of the untamed heart. Part 3. The Rising Smoke, the Rising Fire. The next morning, Alara woke to a stillness so complete it felt sacred. The dawn chorus of birds was the only sound, a stark contrast to the clang and clamor of towns. For the first time in weeks, she hadn't jolted awake in panic. Leo stirred beside her, his breathing deep and even. A fragile peace settled over her, but in the wild peace was a fleeting guess. As she stepped outside, wrapping Leo tighter in her shawl, she saw it, a deliberate, controlled line of black smoke rising against the pale southern sky. It wasn't wildfire. It was a signal. Her blood ran cold. She turned, and Kale was already there, standing at the edge of the ridge, his face a mask of stone as he watched the smoke. The rising sun caught the sharp angles of his face, and the protective fury she'd seen at the auction was back, simmering just beneath the surface. "They're tracking us?" she asked, her voice tight. He didn't look at her, his focus absolute. "No. They are warning us." "Who?" "The men I took you from." The words made her stomach twist. The possessive way he said "took you" sent a thrilling, dangerous shiver down her spine. "You paid for me," she corrected, needing to cling to the transactional nature of it, the only logic she understood. "I did not pay," he said, finally turning his gaze to her, sharp and direct. "I intervened. There is a difference." He stepped closer, his presence a shield. "They think you still belong to them. You never did. That is why they will come." The threat, instead of terrifying her, ignited something fierce within her. Standing beside him, she felt not like prey, but like a predator cornered. "Will they find us?" His eyes scanned the horizon again. "They will try." That afternoon, a new energy pulsed between them. It was the desperate, focused intimacy of two people preparing for battle. He began reinforcing the shelter, packing thicker brush at the entrance. He moved with a fluid grace, every action filled with purpose. He showed her how to scatter their footprints with a pine bough, how to tuck Leo's spare clothes into the crevices of trees to confuse the scent. As he worked, she found herself mesmerized by the raw power of his movements, the flecks of muscle beneath his buckskin. He handed her a knife, its bone handle worn smooth with use. "You should know how to use this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. He stood behind her, his body pressing against hers as he guided her hand. His warmth enveloped her, his breath ghosting across her ear. "The weight must feel like an extension of your arm. Your will." The lesson was practical, but the execution was electric. His proximity was dizzying, the scent of pine and leather and him filling her senses. The world shrank to the circle of his arms, the knife in her hand, and the thundering of her own heart. This closeness, born of necessity, felt more passionate than any calculated seduction. "You've done this before," she stated, her voice breathy. "Helped someone run." "No," he replied, his voice a low vibration against her back. "I have been the one running." The confession hung in the air, a bridge of shared history between them. Then why stop now? Why risk everything for me? He didn't pause his instruction, his hand still firm over hers. "Because if no one ever stops for someone else," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. The world ends in silence, and your silence is a sound I will not allow. That night, she couldn't sleep. The questions about his past were there, but they were overshadowed by the overwhelming reality of his present. He was a man who had been hunted, yet he had stopped to fight for her. She rose from the bed of moss he'd made for her and stood outside under a blanket of stars. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about a love so wild and unexpected, it felt like a force of nature in its own right, a fire that could either warm them or consume them both. From the darkness behind her, Cale's voice came, a low whisper, as if speaking to the ancestors who watched from the stars. She is not running anymore, he vowed. They will have to chase the storm. And Alara knew he wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about them. Part 4. Echoes of a name, forging a new one. They came at dusk, two riders materializing from the twilight mist like wraiths. One wore the dusty coat of Silas, the auctioneer. The other wore the faded blue uniform of a territorial marshal, his face grim and weathered. They tethered their horses near the creek and stood in the clearing, their arrogance a palpable stain on the pristine wilderness. Alara saw them from the shelter's edge, and an old familiar ice snaked through her veins. Leo whimpered in her arms, sensing her fear. But then Cale stepped out, placing himself between her and the intruders. He was utterly calm, an immovable object against their tide of aggression. The sight of him, so fierce and protective, melted her fear and reforged it into white-hot anger. The love she felt for him was a lioness in her chest, roaring to defend its mate. "You found the wrong trail," Cale said, his voice deceptively mild. Silas squinted. "No trail's wrong when it leads to what's missing. We're here for the Walton woman." The name, Walton, hit Alara like a physical blow. It was the name of the man she had married, a man who had promised love, and given her only bruises and debt before disappearing. It was a brand, a mark of ownership she thought she'd left behind. "She is not missing," Cale stated, his voice dropping, taking on the deadly edge of a honed blade. "She is here, with me." The possessiveness in his tone was a declaration of war. The marshal laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Women don't get to decide that out here, Cale. She was taken from property, witnessed, documented. Her mark still on the roster. Fueled by a love that was as wild as it was new, Alara stepped forward, Cale's strength flowing into her. "I sign nothing," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a power she didn't know she possessed. Silas smirked. "Didn't have to. You belong to Walton. His debt passed to his creditors. You were part of the settlement, legal and binding. He hit me." Alara's voice cracked with fury. "Starved me, and you're here to drag me back into that world of legal and binding cages?" The marshal shrugged, his eyes cold. "We don't deal in feelings. We deal in claims." Cale moved again, a subtle shift that placed him more fully in front of her. "You will turn around now, or what?" Silas sneered, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "You'll shoot us? Two of us. One of you." A slow, dangerous smile touched Cale's lips. "I will not need to shoot you," he said softly. "But this land, it remembers its own. It has tasted the blood of men like you before, and it is always hungry for more. You are trespassers here, not just on my land, but against a law far older than your ledgers." The marshal shifted, unsettled by the primal certainty in Cale's voice. But Silas pressed on. "She has a name, Miriam J. Walton, passed down like a brand." The name was a ghost, and Alara felt its chill. But as she looked at Cale, at the unwavering devotion in his eyes, the ghost dissolved. The passionate love she felt for him was a fire that burned away all old chains. "That name is dead," she cried, stepping to his side, their shoulders brushing. It was a united front. "I buried it in the dirt behind your filthy trading post. Names don't die," Silas hissed. "They get recorded." Alara lifted her chin, her gaze locking with his. "Then record this," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "My name is Alara, and I am not for sale. I am not for return. And if you take one more step, I will make sure the next name written down is yours, in stone." The air crackled. The girl with the baby was gone, replaced by a woman forged in fire, her love for the man beside her a weapon more potent than any blade. The marshal saw it. He saw the wild, untamable spirit in her eyes, reflected in Cale's. He saw two people who would die for each other, and he knew a ledger page wasn't worth his life. "She's not coming, Silas," the marshal said quietly, mounting his horse. "Let's go." Silas stared, his face a mask of disbelief, but he followed. They vanished back into the dusk. Alara stood, breathless, her body thrumming with adrenaline and a fierce, triumphant love. She turned to Cale, and in the fading light, there were no more words needed. He pulled her against him, his arms a circle of safety and possession, and his mouth came down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a storm, a claim, a raw and desperate collision of two souls who had found their other half in the heart of the wilderness. It tasted of dust, freedom, and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. Part 5. Burning the past, building a treaty of the heart. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows that made the small shelter feel like a sacred space. Kay was out hunting, a promise of his return before nightfall hanging in the air like a warm blanket. Leo was asleep, his small hand clutched around a braid of Alara's hair. The confrontation had left her shaken, but also incandescently alive. The kiss she had shared with Cale was a brand on her soul, a seal of their untamable bond. Driven by a new resolve, she pulled a small wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, wrapped in linen, was the last relic of her old life. Her wedding ring. Simple, gold, and slightly warped from when she'd thrown it against a fireplace. It was a symbol of ownership, of a love that had turned to poison. In the shelter of this wild land, under the protection of a man who asked for nothing but her heart, the ring felt like a shackle. Nearby lay the ledger Cale had given her. On its first page she had written, "Alara, mother of Leo." Nothing more. No man's name, no price. It was the first time her name had felt like her own. She walked to the fire pit outside, the gold ring cold in her palm. The night was quiet, the wind whispering through the pines like a lover's sigh. She thought of Cale, of the fierce, possessive love in his eyes. He hadn't rescued her to own her. He had fought for her so she could be free. And her first act of true freedom would be to choose him, not as a replacement for a husband, but as a partner, her other half. Forever should never feel like a cage, she whispered, and without flinching, she tossed the ring into the glowing coals. The metal hissed, dulled, and was consumed by the ash. A weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her spirit. When she turned, he was there, standing at the edge of the trees, a rabbit slung over his shoulder. His eyes, even in the dark, were fixed on her, knowing and intense. He didn't ask what she had burned. He didn't need to. They ate in a comfortable silence, but the air between them was thick with unfulfilled promises and a deep, simmering passion. After they finished, as they sat by the fire, she finally asked the question that had been burning beneath every shared glance. "What do you want from me, Cale?" He looked up, his stormy eyes locking with hers. The firelight danced across his rugged features, making him look like a god of this wild land. "Everything," he said, his voice a low, raw growl that sent shivers down her spine. "I want your laughter in the morning and your sighs in the night. I want to see our children run through these woods. I want to fight your battles and warm your bed. I want all of you, Alara, not as a possession, but as the other half of my soul." Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a man who spoke the language of absolute love, without artifice or hesitation. "And what do you offer?" she breathed, already knowing the answer. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "A treaty," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not between nations, but between two people. A treaty of the heart. We don't belong to each other. We choose each other, every day. We build something that is only ours, a fortress against the world." It was the most romantic, most passionate declaration she had ever heard. It wasn't about breathless promises. It was about the steadfast, burning warmth of a fire meant to last through 1,000 winters. It was an understanding between two people who had been broken by the world's rules and had found salvation in a love that made its own. She reached for the ledger and flipped to a new page. Beneath the heading Our Home, she wrote one line: "This home has no master, only witnesses." She slid the book to him. He read her words, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. He took the charcoal pencil and added a line beneath hers. "Then I will witness your heart, and you will witness mine, until our last breath." That night, the storm of their passion finally broke. There were no more hesitations, no more shadows of the past. In the sacred space of the shelter, he showed her what it meant to be loved by a man who was as wild and free as the land itself. It was a fierce and tender claiming, a dance of two souls finally coming home. As the wind howled outside, their bodies created a silent treaty of their own, sealed not in ink or blood, but in the white-hot fire of a love that was truly, incandescently alive. Part 6. The storm within, the calm beyond. The seasons turned. The heavy snows of winter blanketed the ridge, sealing them in a world of white and silence. The threat of the outside world faded, replaced by the rhythm of their life together. The shelter, once a temporary refuge, became a home, filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the quiet laughter of Leo, who was now taking his first steps. The love between Alara and Kale deepened, settling from a raging fire into a steady, life-giving hearth. It was in the way he would bring her a perfect hawk feather, a silent, "I love you." It was in the way she would mend his buckskins, her stitches a prayer for his safety. It was a love expressed in actions, not just words, a wild, passionate partnership forged in the crucible of the frontier. One afternoon, as a blizzard raged outside, Alara sat by the fire, combing her fingers through Leo's soft hair. Kale sat across from her, sharpening a bone knife, but his eyes kept flicking to her, a look of profound, possessive love on his face. "You had a life before me," she said softly, a statement, not a question. "You were running." He looked up, his work forgotten. "I had a sister," he said, his voice tight with old pain. "Traitors came after a raid. They promised peace and took her. I tracked them. I gave her their names and a knife." He paused. "She chose not to take revenge." She said surviving without becoming like them was revenge enough. Did she survive? Alara asked, her heart aching for him. "For a time," he said. "But the world has sharp edges. I built these shelters." He met her gaze, hoping to find someone who needed one. "I never dreamed I would find the one who would build a home with me inside it." Tears stung Alara's eyes. "You didn't just give me a place to land, Kale. You gave me a place to grow wings." He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, kneeling before her and pulling her into his arms. "You were already flying, my heart," he murmured into her hair. "I just caught the wind with you." The storm raged outside, but inside, they were each other's calm. Their love was not an escape from the harshness of the world, but a fortress that allowed them to face it. Years passed. Leo grew from a boy into a young man, with his mother's spirit and Kale's quiet strength. The story of their beginning became a legend, a tale told by the fireside on cold winter nights. One evening Leo, now a man of 16, stood by the ledger, tracing the faded ink. "Mother," he said, his voice deep. "Why doesn't it say who bought you?" Alara smiled, her eyes finding Kale's across the room. The love that passed between them was as fierce and potent as it had been on the first day. She knelt beside her son. "Because no one ever did, my love." But Kale raised his hand. "Yes," she said, her hand finding Kale's. "He raised his hand not to own me, but to stop them from taking me. He raised his hand to declare a war for my heart. A war he had already won." Leo looked from his mother to his father, at the unbreakable bond that radiated between them. "Will you tell the story again?" he asked. And so they did. They told him of the auction, of the defiant woman, and the silent warrior. They spoke of the chase, the confrontation, and the burning of the ring. But this time, they told him of the passion, of the fierce, all-consuming love that had been the true crucible of their family. They told him how their love was a storm that had driven out the silence and created a new world, a world just for them. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the wild land that had borne witness to their story. Inside, their love remained, a fire that refused to go out, a testament to the fact that the wildest hearts find their truest home not in a place, but in each other. The greatest stories of the frontier are not written in ledgers or carved on monuments. They are etched in the heart. Stories of resilience, survival, and a love as wild and untamable as the land itself. Alara and Kale's story teaches us that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of a love that does not seek to own, but to empower. It shows that the deepest passion is found in the treaty between two souls who choose to face the world as one. True strength isn't about never being scared. It's about finding the one person who makes you brave enough to stand and fight, to burn the past, and to build a future from the ashes. Theirs is a story of a storm that protected, and a fire that forever burns bright in the heart of the wild. If this story stirred your soul, please honor its legacy by subscribing to Wild West Stories, liking this video, and sharing it with others who believe in the enduring power of love and freedom.